As a brief review, the last we saw of Jesus after having spent some time in the wilderness, he returned to Galilee. He had acquired quite a reputation within the region as a teacher, so it's no surprise that we find him teaching at his hometown synagogue. Everything seemed to be going well as he offers his words of hope to the people. He tells everyone that it's through him that the words of the prophet Isaiah will be fulfilled. Words of hope for the poor, the oppressed, the captive, and the blind, which sounded like really good news to these folks who had endured the crushing weight of the Roman Empire for almost a century. This was just the sort of encouragement they needed. A sermon, the theme of which was, "Make Israel Great Again." They liked sermons that portrayed them as God's favored ones, and that's what this one was beginning to sound like. So they sat back, ready to bask in the glow of Jesus' words, anticipating not only a message of hope for them, but also one of condemnation against their Roman oppressors. Words of judgment against this bunch of dirty Gentile outsiders. But things began to go south when Jesus lifted up a couple of sermon illustrations that made it clear to his audience that God's realm of grace is for everybody. First, he reminded them of the story from the 17th chapter of the book of 1 Kings that took place during a 3.5 year drought that resulted in a severe famine for Israel and the surrounding area. God told the prophet Elijah to go to Zarephath, the Gentile hometown of his nemesis, the evil queen Jezebel. And it was there that he would meet a widow and her son who were down to the last handful of meal and just a little oil. Well, Elijah wasn't thrilled about his marching orders, but he obeyed anyway. And to make a long story short, the jar of meal and the jug of oil miraculously never ran out. And Elijah, the Gentile widow, and her son survived the famine. And Jesus pointed out to his listeners that even though there were plenty of starving Jewish widows to whom Elijah could have been sent, instead God sent Elijah to a Gentile widow. And I imagine the listening audience began looking at each other, some whispering to their neighbor, "Did he just say what I think he said?" And just to make sure everyone understood what he was trying to say, Jesus offered up a second history lesson. This one from the 5th chapter of the book of 2 Kings, in which Elisha, Elijah's protege, was commanded by God to cure a wealthy and powerful Syrian general who suffered from leprosy. Well, needless to say, Elisha wasn't any more pleased about using his miraculous healing power to cure a Gentile army officer than his mentor was about rescuing a Gentile widow from starvation. But he did it anyway. And Jesus, driving his point home, said to his audience, "There were also many with the skin disease in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian." Well, his listeners were as enraged by his words as was President Trump by Bishop Buddy's words that described a God whose compassion and grace extended to the very people that Trump and his cronies considered to be their enemies. And we read that Jesus' hometown audience got up, drove him out of town, and were about to throw him off a cliff. But then the story abruptly closes with the words, "But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way." Now, this story is one of those kinds of stories that has something to say to just about everyone. but it holds a special meaning for anyone who has been led to feel at one time or another in their life that they are an outsider. And let's face it, that's most of us here this morning. If you are a transgender person or a same-sex loving person who has had the Bible used as a weapon against you, this story is for you. If you blur the boundaries with your bisexual self, your non-binary self, your genderqueer, gender fluid, or your intersex self, this story is for you. If you push the envelope with your polyamorous self or your asexual self, this story is for you. If you are a woman who has no say over your bodily autonomy, who has been told over and over that you are less than men and who is sick of hearing it, if you feel like a punching bag because of your gender and you carry the scars of physical, psychological, and spiritual abuse from others, this story is for you. This story is for the person who lives each day with the stigma of HIV, for the black person who breaks out in a sweat when they see the flashing lights of a cop's car in their rearview mirror. It's for the immigrant who has lived in fear of deportation, even though they pay taxes, work hard, and have lived here for decades. It's for physically disabled people who are treated as if they are mentally disabled. And it's for the unhoused person who has grown accustomed to feeling invisible. This story is for everyone who has ever been made to feel as if they are on the outside looking in. And it's for everyone who is audacious enough to live out their truth regardless of how uncomfortable it makes others feel. Because it will. It will not only make others feel uncomfortable, but it will enrage them. How dare you? How dare you claim your place at God's banquet table of love? How dare you refuse to go to the back of the line? How dare you imagine that God's grace includes you too? Their words, their lies about you will cut you to the quick. But if you listen long enough, you will begin to believe them. Joseph Goebbels, the chief propagandist for the Nazi Party, once said, if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it, even when the lie is about they themselves. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way. After shining a light on the truth of God's grace, when that truth was rejected, Jesus simply walked through their anger and went on his way. He didn't hold on to their rage. He walked through it and away from it. There have been a lot of executive orders coming from the White House lately. They threaten and invalidate women, the LGBTQIA plus community, black people, people of color, and immigrants. Those executive orders are no different than a first century mob of people trying to silence Jesus when he spoke his truth. But just as the crowd's rage didn't silence Jesus, neither should we allow anyone to silence ours. It didn't silence 15-year-old Elizabeth Eckford, an American civil rights activist and one of the Little Rock Nine, a group of African-American students who in 1957 were the first black students ever to attend classes at the previously all-white Little Rock Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. The image of 15-year-old Eckford walking alone through a screaming mob in front of Central High School propelled the crisis into the nation's living rooms and brought international attention to Little Rock. We must speak our truth and live out our truth. And if it isn't received, With examples like Jesus, Elizabeth Eckford, and many others, we can walk past the people's rage and away from it, confident in God's eternal, loving grace and hopeful of the future which lies before us. Never believe the lie that you are anything other than God's beautiful and beloved child. Amen.